this.
Yes.
So, yes, so just some.
Is this amplify as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and we have a day of teaching and also meditation. So we're very fortunate to have this opportunity to come together and do something that is beneficial for ourselves and also beneficial for others. And usually in the Tibetan tradition, we begin activities, Dharma activities, such as listening to teachings, doing meditation, and so forth, by doing some prayers, some meditation. The main purpose of doing these prayers and meditation is to make sure that we're in a good state of mind, having a good intention, a good motivation, because this ties in with the law of karma, or cause and effect. Whatever we do will bring about results, consequences, effects. And it's natural that we would wish to have the best possible results from the actions that we do. And it said that the most important factor that determines what kind of results will come from our actions is the motivation that we have, why we're doing something. So it said that even if we do an action that might look like a good thing, but if we're doing it with a bad motivation, for example, sometimes a person might make a donation, a gift, offering money to some worthy cause, some charitable organization, which is normally a good thing to do. And it is a good thing because that money will benefit other people. But if the person has a motivation that's not completely clear and straight and positive, then the action becomes a little mixed. For example, they might make this donation because they want people to like them, to think well of them, to, praise them, and so forth. And so they're not thinking so much of the people that will benefit from their donation. They're more thinking about themselves and their own fame, their own how they appear in the eyes of others, and so forth. So then it becomes a kind of a mixed action, not totally positive, not totally pure, we might say. So that's just an illustration of how the motivation that we have for the things that we do is very, very important. And so we always try to have a good motivation when we do meditation or other kinds of spiritual activities, such as learning about the Dharma and benefiting others and so on. And so it said that the best motivation that we could have is what we call altruism, which means caring about others, wishing to help others, wishing to benefit others and not harm them, and so forth. So I think we all do have this intention, at least sometimes. Sometimes we really do feel strongly and sincerely the wish to benefit others. But it's important to try to make sure that that's the motivation that we have when we learn spiritual teachings or we engage in spiritual practices, that we're doing it as much as possible with the motivation to benefit others, rather than wanting to get something just for oneself. Okay, so I thought that we would start by reciting a couple of prayers, and this is optional. You don't have to recite the prayers, but probably some of you would like to do so. And so if you have this little notebook with what's called Essential Buddhist Prayers, and if you turn to page 98, at the bottom of that page, there's the prayer of refuge and bodhicitta before teaching. So this is a common standard prayer that is recited at the beginning of teachings, before teachings, and it just expresses our wish to take refuge in the Buddha. Did everyone find it? We have some problem?
There are two kinds of books.
Oh, different versions of the book. Okay. Maybe some can share if you don't have the book, or you can share with your neighbor. So yeah, so this expresses our what we call refuge, taking refuge or going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, the Sangha. These are the three objects. They're called the three jewels, three objects that we take refuge in Buddhism. Taking refuge can mean that we put ourselves under the guidance of the Buddha and his teachings. It's expressing our wish to follow the Buddha, to follow his example, to follow his teachings as much as we can in our life out of respect for him. That's in the first two lines of the prayer, and the second two lines expresses what's called bodhicitta, or the mind of enlightenment. This is basically altruism. It's the wish to do whatever we can to benefit others, to benefit the world. And so when we're in this situation like here of listening to teachings, doing meditation and so on, we try to think, I'm doing this not just for me, but for the benefit of others. I want to help others as much as I can. And if you can think, if you can feel the wish to become enlightened, to become a Buddha yourself, that is really the best motivation to have, thinking, I'm listening to teachings or I'm doing meditation because I wish to become a Buddha. I wish to do what the Buddha did and attain the state that the Buddha attained, so that I can then be of benefit to others as much as I can. So if you're comfortable with those ideas, then we can recite this prayer together 3 times. But again, it's totally optional. Don't feel obliged if you don't wish to do this. So we'll recite it in English so that we understand better what we're saying. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, and there's another prayer which we sometimes recite, but I wasn't able to find it here in this book, and it's called Prayer of the Four Immeasurables. So what I'll do is I'll just recite it, and you can close your eyes and meditate on it. Try to generate these 4 states of mind. So the 4 immeasurables are 4 states of mind, which are different aspects of altruism, the altruistic intention. So one is love or loving kindness, and that is to wish others to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And then there's compassion, which is wishing others to be free of suffering and its causes. And then there's what's called joy, or sometimes rejoicing, and that is wishing others to have perfect happiness, perfect peace, especially the higher states of liberation and enlightenment. And then the fourth is called equanimity, and that is wishing others, but also ourselves. We need to have these same four wishes for ourselves as well as for others. Wishing everyone to have an attitude of mind which isn't motivated by attachment, liking some people, being really nice to some people on the one hand, and then aversion or dislike, where we dislike other people and we don't want to help them and maybe even want to harm them. So to be free of those two states of mind, which lead to a lot of problems and suffering, and instead have a state of what we call equanimity, which means an unbiased attitude towards others, where we're open to seeing everyone with respect and care and compassion and wanting to help them. So I'll just recite that prayer, and you can listen and try to generate these four thoughts, these four states of mind. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from the happiness that is free of suffering. So that means that real, pure, long-lasting happiness of liberation or nirvana and enlightenment. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of attachment and aversion that hold some close and keep others distant. So if you do feel comfortable with the idea of altruism, wishing others to be happy, to be free of suffering, wishing that you yourself can help others as much as you can in your life, if that attitude feels right, feels comfortable for you, then see if you can bring into your mind the thought or the intention that your reason for being here and listening to the teachings and doing the meditations that we're going to be doing today, your reason is to benefit not just yourself, but also others, as many other people, as many other beings as possible. And if you're comfortable with the idea, you can think of all beings, all sentient beings everywhere, that you would like to benefit them, to not harm them. And on top of that, if you can feel the wish that you could follow in the Buddha's footsteps and attain the state of enlightenment, state of Buddhahood, to be able to help others in the best way possible, then you can add that into your motivation. Or in a simple way, A simple way to generate a positive motivation would be to just think, try to feel that what we are doing here today, however much you're able to participate in today's activities, that this may be of benefit to other people, other beings, to the world as much as possible. Even just making a small contribution to peace and happiness and well-being and freedom from suffering. So generating that wish, that intention. Okay, so we will do more meditation later. First, I'm gonna talk a little bit. So this, I don't know what you call it, this class or course that we're doing here today, or maybe we could think of it as a one-day retreat, is actually part of a course which I started teaching a couple of weeks ago in Copenhagen. I recently moved there to take up my new job as resident teacher in the center in Copenhagen, which is a kind of sister center to this group, the Tara Liberation Study Group. And we had this idea of having a course that would run for the next couple of months. And the title of the course is Exploring Buddhist Philosophy. And it's intended for people who have already learned Buddhism to a certain extent. They've done some basic teachings, courses, and they have a certain amount of knowledge of Buddhism, and they would like to expand their knowledge, increase their knowledge, further their knowledge, deepen their knowledge. And so it's sort of a little bit higher level of teachings than the most basic level. And this in turn is a sort of preparation for a study program which we have within our organization, the FPMT, which is called a basic program, but it's actually not really that basic. It's actually somewhat advanced. It's kind of based on some of the studies that are done in the Tibetan monasteries by the lamas who become geshis. Geshe is like a professor of Buddhist studies. And they often spend 20 years, between 15 and 20 or even more years, studying the classical Buddhist texts from the Indian masters, the Tibetan masters, in Buddhist philosophy, in order to have a really good understanding of Buddhist philosophy. So it's difficult for us Westerners to do that kind of program, although there are some monks and nuns who follow that program and gain that very high level of knowledge of Buddhist philosophy. But usually to do that, you have to learn Tibetan, because the program is all in Tibetan. So you have that additional challenge of learning Tibetan. So anyway, we developed within the FPMT programs in which we study at least some of the texts, the classical Indian and Tibetan texts that are studied in the Tibetan monasteries. And so there's one program called the Basic Program where we study some of those texts. And it's somewhat advanced and difficult. And so we thought to have this program, which is called Exploring Buddhist Philosophy, as a sort of bridge between very basic, very elementary introductory levels of Buddhist studies and the basic program. Sort of get people warmed up, prepared for the basic program. And we thought to offer this program in this area, the Nordic Baltic area, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and also Latvia. So there's some people who are watching this this program online. So hello to all of you watching from afar. And so I already started this. So anyway, this program, Exploring Buddhist Philosophy, is divided into 4 parts, 4 modules. The first is called the Buddha and His Teachings. And so we started this a couple of weeks ago. And what I covered so far is just a brief look at the Buddha's life and then his first teaching. So after the Buddha became enlightened, he gave his first teaching, his first sermon, which is a sutra called the Sutra of Setting in Motion the Wheel of Dharma. And in that sutra, he explained, the main topic explained in that sutra is the Four Noble Truths. And he also explained the Eightfold Path. So in this module of the program, I'm mainly focusing on the Four Noble Truths, and within that we will also look at the Eightfold Path, which is one way of explaining the Buddhist path, the path that the Buddha taught for how to progress spiritually, develop ourselves spiritually, and free ourselves from suffering. And so I'll just briefly review what I have talked about so far, and then carry on from there. So the other night in Copenhagen, I gave a talk about in general the Four Noble Truths, and why it is important to understand the Four Noble Truths and why it is beneficial to understand this. So one reason it's important and beneficial is because if we have an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, it gives us a kind of framework or a kind of outline to understand the whole of the Buddhist path. So Buddha, after he attained enlightenment, he lived for another 45 years and was teaching a lot. So the Buddhist teachings, the Buddhist scriptures, when they're in book form, you know, are like this. I don't know, they have in some, they have some of these texts up here, which are probably some of the Buddha's own words. There's about 108 volumes in the Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan canon of the Buddha's words, Buddha's teachings. So it's a lot. It's a lot of material, a lot of information there. And when we start to learn Buddhism, we might sometimes feel a bit overwhelmed by the amount of information there is. But if we have an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, then it helps us to know when we hear some new information, we receive some new teaching, we can slot it into the Four Noble Truths. So knowing the Four Noble Truths gives us an overview of the whole of the Buddhist path, the whole of the Buddha's teachings, and helps us to make a bit of sense, a bit of order to this huge amount of material and information. And so it's beneficial not just in terms of intellectual understanding, but also in terms of practice, because the Buddha's teachings are really meant to be practiced, to be lived in our life. It's not just information, knowledge. And having an understanding of the Four Noble Truths will also help us understand how to practice, what it is we need to do in our life if we do wish to follow the Buddhist teachings, the Buddhist path. And so we can learn how to at least begin to walk along this path, take the first few steps along the path that leads to freedom from suffering, to real peace and happiness, and so on. So those are some of the benefits we can experience by having an understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And so then my plan in this program is to go through each of the Four Truths and look at each one in greater depth, greater detail. So the first of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of suffering. And as I mentioned the other night in Copenhagen, this is a somewhat challenging topic because suffering is not a pleasant subject to look at, to hear about, to think about, to meditate on. I think especially in the West, we tend to have this idea that the practice of meditation should be about things that are wonderful, beautiful, pleasing, happy, make us feel good. So then if you hear about meditating on suffering, you might think, you feel kind of aversion to doing that. So it's important to understand why we need to look at this topic of suffering and think about it and meditate on it. And the main reason is because it exists. It's there. Suffering is there in our life and in the lives of others and in the world around us. It's something that is true, something that exists. And if we don't have a good understanding of it, if we are not willing to look at it and work with it and deal with it and face it in a realistic way, then it's just going to continue. It doesn't go away, it doesn't stop by itself. And so this is actually the main message that the Buddha gave. Suffering is there, suffering exists. It's painful, it's unpleasant. It's something we don't want to experience. But if we want to not experience suffering, if we want to be free of suffering, we have to be willing to look at it and to understand what are the causes of suffering? Where does suffering come from? What brings about suffering? Because then we can do something about it. Then we can eliminate the causes of suffering, which is the third noble truth. So the first noble truth is suffering, the existence of suffering, and then the second is the origin of suffering, the causes of suffering. What is it that gives rise to suffering? And then the third truth is the cessation of suffering, the stopping of suffering, the elimination of suffering, being free of suffering. That is a possibility. That is something that exists. That is something that we can attain. And then the fourth noble truth is the path. How do we stop suffering? How do we become free of suffering? How do we eliminate it? What is it that we have to do? So people sometimes say that Buddhism is pessimistic because it talks so much about suffering. But we have to remember that Buddha didn't only teach suffering. That's only the first of the four truths. He taught three more after that. So if we only stop with the first truth, then yeah, it's very pessimistic. It's very unpleasant, very kind of negative. But he went on to explain what are the causes of suffering, and then the fact that suffering can be eliminated, and how to do that. Okay, so he didn't only teach suffering. He taught its cause, its elimination, and the way to do that. So it's actually very positive, very optimistic, because it says that this is possible for everyone. Everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what kind of being they are, everyone has the ability, the potential, the possibility of becoming free of suffering. So if we understand the whole picture of the Four Noble Truths, then it's actually very positive, very optimistic. And in the sutra, and by the way, I prepared some materials for this program, and we're still kind of in the initial stages of organizing it. But anyone who is interested in receiving these materials, we can make an email list, and the materials can be sent to you. So among the materials is a copy of the sutra, the first turning of the wheel sutra, in which the Buddha explains the Four Noble Truths, and then there's also some notes which I'm teaching from, and so we can arrange for those to be emailed to you And then you can have them on your computer or iPad or print them out as you wish. So, but in my talks, I'm covering the main points of what's in the materials. And so in the sutra, this first sutra, first teaching that the Buddha gave, he spoke about each of the Four Noble Truths by way of 3 phases. And with regard to the first truth, the truth of suffering, the first phase is just pointing out the existence of that particular truth or its nature, just pointing it out. There it is, that's it. So with regard to the truth of suffering, the Buddha simply said, suffering exists, there is suffering. Okay, so just pointing out the existence of that. And then the second of the 3 phases is what it is we need to do in relation to that particular truth. How do we relate to it? How do we practice it? So with respect to the first truth, the truth of suffering, what it is we need to do is to understand it. So the Buddha said, suffering is to be understood, is to be known. Okay, we need to know it, to understand it. And the third of the 3 phases is the result of practicing. So if you practice the second point, the second phase, then you achieve some result. So with regard to this first truth, the truth of suffering, the third phase is what the Buddha said, his own words was, suffering has been fully understood. So he's talking about his own experience, because in case you're not familiar with the life of the Buddha started off as a person, an ordinary person, an ordinary man like ourselves, although it's said that he was a prince. He was born into a royal family and lived a very comfortable life, very pleasurable, enjoyable life, full of luxury and pleasure and so on, until he was in his late 20s. And then he encountered suffering. He came to know suffering by first meeting somebody who was very, very sick, really suffering from physical illness, then a person who was very old. So he came to know about the suffering of aging, how as we get older, our body breaks down and we have more and more difficulties physically and also mentally, emotionally. So he came to know about that. And then he encountered death in the form of a funeral, and came to know that this is what happens at the end of everyone's life. We all die, and that's difficult for the person who's dying, but also for the loved ones, family and friends who are left behind. They experience grief. So coming to know about these experiences, which are part of everyone's life, every human being, at some time or another experiences sickness. We all get old and lose our physical health and beauty and energy and so on, and eventually we all die. So these experiences, these encounters had a very profound effect on him, because he thought, this is where we're all headed. All of us are headed towards these experiences. If we haven't already experienced them, this is eventually what will happen to us. So how can we just, enjoy ourselves, eat, drink, and be merry, and, not be concerned about, what's coming? It's kind of foolish. And so this then led him to have the wish to change his lifestyle and begin to follow a spiritual path. So he came to know about that as well through meeting a meditator, a person who was following a spiritual path, living a spiritual life, and he generated this wish to do the same himself. So then he embarked on a spiritual lifestyle and eventually attained enlightenment. so then during his practice, his practice of meditation, he came to understand these Four Noble Truths, and it's by fully understanding, fully realizing these four truths, these four things which are true about life, about existence. This is what enabled him to totally transform his mind and bring his mind to the state of enlightenment, which means being completely free of suffering and its causes. So when the Buddha was expressing or explaining the Four Noble Truths in this first teaching, this first sutra, this is what he said: suffering has been fully understood. So he's talking about his own experience. He came to that full, complete understanding of suffering. And that was one of the understandings, one of the realizations that enabled him to become enlightened. And so we might think, well, I understand suffering. I have plenty of suffering in my life, and I can see there's suffering in the world around me. I understand suffering. But is that true? Do we really have a good understanding of suffering? Because as we will go into later, there are different levels of suffering, and some are more coarse, gross, obvious kinds of suffering. But there are some that are quite subtle and not so easy to see, not so easy to understand. And we really have to contemplate, meditate in order to understand the more subtle aspects of suffering. So when the Buddha said that he had full understanding of suffering, he was able to see all the aspects of suffering, not just the obvious ones, but even the very, very subtle ones, which most people don't see, most people don't recognize. So if we really want to follow in the Buddha's footsteps and gain the same realizations and the same attainments that he attained, we also need to look into suffering in a very deep way, in a very subtle way, and come to understand the very subtle aspects of it. Yeah, so maybe that's enough for now, because I would like to lead a meditation. I don't want to just spend all the time talking. So with regard to understanding suffering in the Tibetan tradition, there are different types of meditations that we can do on suffering, going through different lists of different types of suffering. And one of these is 8 types of suffering. And these 8 types of suffering were actually mentioned specifically by the Buddha in this first sutra, which I forgot to bring today. I forgot to bring a copy of it. Anyway, doesn't matter. So I thought we could do a meditation on these 8 types of suffering now. And have all of you had experience doing analytical meditation? Anyone not familiar with analytical meditation? Anyway, if it's a kind of meditation that's like reflection or contemplation, thinking. It involves thinking, contemplating. And this type of meditation is done in order to have a better understanding of what the Buddha taught. It's a way of, because it's one thing when we attend a class, a teaching, and we listen to, words that the teacher is speaking, and we get a certain amount of understanding of what is being said, but it's still somewhat superficial. So ideally what we want to do is to really think about or reflect on or contemplate in a deeper way what the teachings are saying, so that we get a deeper understanding. It's like bringing our understanding to a deeper level rather than just superficial. So that is the purpose of doing analytical meditation. So during this meditation, I'm going to be talking, introducing the points for you to meditate on. So then what you need to do is just try to pay attention, try to really focus on what I'm saying, and then I'll give you some time to think about each point. So do the best you can to stay focused, stay concentrated, not start thinking about what you're going to do later today or what you saw on television last night. So try to really stay focused on the meditation itself. And if you have questions that arise, we can take care of those later on. Okay, so let's start the meditation. And as always, when we meditate, it's helpful to try to sit with a straight back. Keep your back straight, but at the same time, let your body be relaxed, not tense, tight. So let the muscles in your body relax, but at the same time, keep your back straight. And if you want, you can close your eyes, but if you can, it's good to keep your eyes open a little bit so there's light coming in that helps you to stay awake, helps you to avoid sleepiness, drowsiness. And try to just let your breathing be natural, normal, steady rhythm. So I'm going to mention these 8 types of suffering one by one and give you some time to think about each one. So in thinking about it, in some cases you might be able to think of experiences you yourself have had of this type of suffering. But if that's not possible, you can think of other people's experiences that you may have seen, observed, or heard about. Again, the point is to try to get a deeper experience, a deeper understanding of these different types of suffering. And if at any point in the meditation you find yourself feeling kind of emotionally upset, you know, like feeling very sad or depressed or despair, which is quite normal when we look at suffering, make us feel quite unhappy. It's better not to get caught up in those kind of feelings. And a remedy to such feelings is to remind yourself of impermanence. That means that things are not permanent, they don't last forever, they change. And so that is true of suffering. So even though suffering exists, it's there, it happens, but it's not something permanent that will last forever. It's impermanent, it comes to an end. So you could remind yourself of that, and hopefully that will help you to avoid getting overwhelmed by unhappy feelings. So the first of the 8 types of suffering is the suffering of birth. So the Buddha said birth is suffering. Now, for many of us in the West, this might be difficult to accept because we have the tendency to feel very happy when a baby is born. This is an occasion of joy and delight and celebration and congratulations and so on. And so we might not notice that there's actually suffering involved in birth. So, of course, we know that a mother, the mother giving birth, usually has suffering. Some of you have probably experienced that yourself. It's very painful to give birth to a baby. And in Buddhism, it's said that the baby also experiences suffering. The process of coming out from the womb into the world is painful for the baby, and also can be somewhat emotionally traumatic to emerge from the womb into the bright light of outside, and being handled by all these strangers and so on. So maybe not always, but sometimes it's traumatic for this little baby to go through the process of being born. So just think about that and see if you can accept that. And then another reason why the Buddha said that birth is suffering is because being born is like the beginning of life, and in the course of one's life, one will experience other kinds of suffering. Of course, there's pleasure, there's happiness, but there is also suffering. Just having a body, having this kind of human body, physical body, naturally brings with it the sufferings of getting sick, being hungry, thirsty, being cold, being hot, falling down, hurting ourselves, and so on. So various kinds of physical sufferings and also emotional sufferings. Being disappointed when we don't get what we want, being upset when we lose something that we want to keep, and so on. Getting hurt by other people, their remarks, their behavior. So as soon as someone is born, it's like the beginning of a life in which one will experience suffering and problems. Then the second of the 8 types of suffering is the suffering of aging. And the term aging in Buddhism doesn't just mean getting old, but it said that aging actually starts right after birth. Right? From the second moment that we are born, we already start to age. So it's something that starts right after we're born, and then it continues all through our life. Each day, each hour, each minute, each second, we are getting older. But the suffering of aging usually doesn't start until we're older. I mean, sometimes it can start in your 30s or 40s. You can start to have arthritis, you can start to have aches and pains in your bones and so on. But usually when we're much older, maybe in our 70s or 80s or 90s, then it becomes really problematic. So it's just inevitable that as our body gets older and ages, it starts to have more problems, more things go wrong, and we're more susceptible to different kinds of illnesses, heart disease, cancer, and so forth, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. And our bones become more fragile, more easy to break, to get fractures and broken bones and so on. So some of you might know this from your own experience, but if not, you probably have parents or grandparents who are going through these kinds of experiences. So just spend some time thinking about that and thinking about some of the difficulties that people experience as their bodies get older. Another thing that can happen as our bodies get older is that our senses deteriorate. Our eyesight, our ability to see, can deteriorate. Our hearing, we might even go deaf. Our sense of smell and taste, which could affect our ability to enjoy food. Our bodily sense, we might have more physical pain, aches and pains in our body. So this can lead to suffering more on the mental or emotional level. Another thing that can happen as we get older is we might find ourselves somewhat shunned or treated in a disrespectful way by people. So it's quite common in society that people adore and worship youth and beauty. We can just see that by looking at magazines. The models are always very young people. And as people get older and their bodies are not so attractive and they have more wrinkles and so on, then society can sometimes not treat them very well. So as we get older, as our bodies get older and less attractive, we might find ourselves somewhat disrespected by other people. We're not given the same kind of attention and respect and kindness that we may have been treated to when we were younger. So that can be another source of mental or emotional suffering as we get older. Then the third type of suffering Buddha pointed out was that of sickness. So this is something that could happen any time in life. Even infants or small children can sometimes get sick. So we probably have our own experiences of illness, and we know what it's like, having physical discomfort or even pain, difficulties, feeling weak. And if it's a serious illness, we might need to go into a hospital. which isn't a very pleasant experience. We have to go through different kinds of medical treatments, having needles stuck in our body, maybe going through an operation, having to take medicine, which might be unpleasant, have unpleasant side effects, and so on. You just think from your own experience or the experience of people you know about some of the unpleasant effects of illness. And then the fourth type of suffering, Buddha mentioned that we all have to experience is that of death. So I think people, and not just people, but also animals, insects, living beings, don't want to die. We have this strong sense of preservation of our life, wanting to stay alive no matter what. We don't want our life to end. We don't want to die. So death is something we regard with fear, with dread, with dislike, and try to avoid it. And it's okay. It's okay to try to stay alive as long as possible. But sooner or later, we will have to face death. That is something we'll have to go through. And it might involve physical discomfort. Sometimes there's pain at the time of death, but not always. Some people die without much pain. But even if we don't have physical pain, there might be mental or emotional pain because of having to leave behind our loved ones, people we love, people we care about, people we want to stay with, not separate from. So that can lead to emotional pain. And also our property, our possessions, our body, all the things of this life. We want to keep these things, not separate from them, but inevitably we do have to separate from them when we die. Then the fifth type of suffering mentioned by the Buddha is that of meeting with unpleasant objects or people or experiences. So as we go through life, from time to time, we encounter things that are unpleasant, unwanted. For example, people. This can start when we're very young. Sometimes certain family members might be unpleasant to us, maybe even abusive or hurtful to us. Or when we meet with other children in the neighborhood or at school. Some of these children might be bullies. They might mistreat us, say hurtful things, do hurtful things to us, and so on. And this can continue throughout life. Even though we don't want to meet such people, but again and again, we do encounter people that are difficult to get along with, people that are unpleasant to us, people that bring up unpleasant thoughts and feelings, people who might even hurt us. This is just one example of this type of suffering, of meeting with unwanted, unpleasant experiences as we go through life. And then the sixth type of suffering is having to separate from what is pleasant. So as we go through life, there are people and objects and experiences that we find pleasant, make us happy, make us feel good. And we naturally want to keep close to those objects. We want to stay with them. We want them to be there as much as possible, not separate from them. But we're not always able to do that. So we often have to separate from, for example, when someone we love, someone we care about passes away or leaves. They have to go away, or they choose to go away. And so they're no longer there for us to spend time with and receive joy with, and so on. And the same with our possessions, our belongings. Sometimes they get lost, or they get broken, or stolen. So we're no longer able to enjoy them as we would like. So just try to bring to mind some examples of this from your own experience of having to separate from pleasant people, objects, and experiences that you don't want to separate from, but you have no choice. And then the seventh type of suffering mentioned by the Buddha is not getting what we want. So one of our main emotions, what we call delusion or afflictive emotion in Buddhism, is attachment, desire. So again and again during our life we have this emotion coming up. We desire certain things, we wish for certain things. It could be a particular person that we want to be in a relationship with, it could be a particular object that we want to own. It could also be something more abstract, like knowledge or certain types of experiences we want to have as part of our experience, and so on. many, many different things we could become attached to or have desire for, and to want to possess, to want to make part of our life. But we aren't always successful in doing this. We don't always manage to get the things that we wish for. And that can lead to the suffering of disappointment. So again, you can bring to mind experiences you yourself have had of this, or others' experiences, to get a sense of this type of suffering that everyone experiences it at least sometimes in their life. And the eighth type of suffering that the Buddha mentioned is the suffering of our five aggregates. So the five aggregates are basically what make us up, what we are made of. They can be simplified into just two, our body and mind. So basically we have a body, physical body, that includes all the physical parts of us. And then we have a mind, which includes all of our conscious experiences, all of our thoughts, feelings, emotions. So we are like a package consisting of a body and mind, physical and mental components. And this body and mind that we have has its origins in unskillful, unwise factors, which we'll look at later. Basically, delusions, afflictive emotions, and karma. Those are the main causes that gave rise to this collection of physical and mental aggregates, our body and mind. And as long as we have this set of aggregates that came from karma and delusions, then we are in a situation of suffering. It's like our whole being, our whole existence is pervaded by suffering because we're not completely free. We don't have complete, total freedom or liberation. We're not enlightened, we're not liberated. So it's as though we are in a prison, having this impure, contaminated body and mind means that we are like in a prison, not completely free. So this is actually a difficult point to understand. We'll look at it more later. We'll talk about it more later. But in case you're feeling somewhat depressed or unhappy or pessimistic after thinking about these different kinds of suffering that we experience in our life, remember that the point of meditating on suffering is not to suffer, is not to be unhappy, but rather to generate the motivation, the intention, the inspiration to do something about the situation. And it is possible to do that. The Buddha's reason for pointing out suffering was so that we get inspired to do what we have to do to become free of suffering. And that is possible. Suffering is not permanent. It's not something that's going to exist forever. We can be free of it. But to be free of it, we have to make some effort. We have to put energy into practicing the methods to be free of suffering. So that is the ideal state of mind that we should come to after thinking about suffering. We should think, I really want to be free of suffering. I really want to do whatever it takes, whatever needs to be done to free myself from suffering. Then on top of that, you can also think, if I can free myself from suffering, then I can also do the same for others. I can help others to also be free of suffering. So see if you can come to that state of mind as a conclusion to this meditation. So when you feel ready to come out of the meditation, you can slowly open your eyes and relax your position. Okay, so we have time now for break. We'll have a break for about 15 minutes. So we'll start again about a little bit after 11:30, as we went a little bit over time. Thank you.
Would you like to still drink?
Well, it's good to have water here just in case my throat gets dried. Thank you.